Ethan Blackwell was a man carved from stone, or at least, that's how people described him. His tailored navy suits never wrinkled, his jet-black hair was always perfectly in place, and his pale gray eyes carried the chill of winter even in midsummer. As the CEO of Blackwell Marine Enterprises, he ruled the eastern seaboard's shipping lanes with ruthless precision. Competitors feared him, investors trusted him, and women adored him. But Ethan had learned long ago that admiration came with a price. The last woman he had loved, Sabrina Clark, had been everything society claimed a man like him should want: elegant, well-connected, and impossibly beautiful. Yet when his company faced a temporary crisis, caused by a crooked partner, Sabrina hadn't stood by him. She had walked away without a backward glance, trading her engagement ring for a wealthier man's arm. Since then, Ethan's heart had been an impenetrable fortress. His distaste for shallow affection had turned into a quiet hatred for women who wore charm like a mask. In his mind, they were all the same, smiling when the champagne flowed, vanishing when the storm came. When the relentless stress of corporate battles began gnawing at him, Ethan decided to get away, not for leisure, but for business. His company owned an old harbor in Seabreeze Cove, a small fishing town 2 hours from the nearest city. The docks were undergoing renovations, and he wanted to personally inspect the progress. On the morning he arrived, the salty air hit him like a forgotten memory. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries mixing with the slap of waves against weathered wood. The scent of diesel fuel from fishing boats mingled with the briny freshness of the ocean. It was a far cry from the polished steel and glass of his Manhattan office. He walked the length of the dock, clipboard in hand, his eyes sweeping over cranes, stacks of lumber, and workers shouting to one another. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw her. She was standing behind a simple wooden stall, its surface glistening with freshly caught fish laid over crushed ice. Her brown hair was tied back in a messy bun, tucked under a faded baseball cap. A loose blue sweatshirt hung over her lean frame, the sleeves pushed up to her elbows. She worked with swift, sure motions, a sharp knife flashing in her hand as she gutted a silver mackerel. What caught Ethan's attention wasn't her appearance, it was her focus. She didn't glance up when passers-by lingered. She didn't call out to attract customers. There was no fake smile, no practiced pitch. She was simply working, her concentration absolute, as if the rest of the world didn't exist. For reasons he couldn't quite name, Ethan slowed his pace. He found himself watching the way she rinsed the fish with seawater, the way her forearms flexed with the effort, the way she moved with an economy of motion born from years of repetition. He wasn't sure if it was curiosity or something else, but for the first time in months, Ethan's thoughts weren't on profits, contracts, or the next hostile takeover. They were on her, the fish seller who seemed entirely untouched by the pretense of the world he knew. And without realizing it, the cold CEO took his first step toward a tide he would never be able to turn back. The next morning, Ethan returned to the dock earlier than planned. Officially, he told himself it was to inspect the piling reinforcements before the workers started. Unofficially, he wasn't so sure. Seabreeze Cove was already awake. Fishermen hauled crates of their morning catch from boats that rocked gently in the tide. The cries of gulls echoed overhead, mingling with the creak of ropes and the slap of waves. The salty breeze tugged at his coat, carrying the smell of ocean and fresh fish. And there she was again. The girl from yesterday, sleeves rolled to her elbows, stood at the same stall. A light layer of frost clung to the fish spread across the bed of crushed ice in front of her, striped bass, flounder, and mackerel gleaming under the morning sun. She looked up briefly, only because a customer was paying. She counted the bills with quick fingers, handed over a paper-wrapped bundle, and immediately went back to work. No sales pitch. No lingering glance. No attempt to charm. Ethan found himself stepping closer before his mind caught up with his feet. "Fresh catch," she said as he approached, her voice low but clear. "Mackerel, tuna, or flounder?" "You don't introduce yourself?" Ethan asked, raising an eyebrow. Her eyes flicked up to meet his, calm, unamused, a shade of green that reminded him of deep-sea water. "I sell fish, not myself," she replied, turning back to her knife. The answer disarmed him. In his world, introductions were currency. The more polished they were, the more valuable. She had just tossed that notion overboard like it meant nothing. "I'll take the mackerel," he said, more curious than hungry. She wrapped the fish in paper, tied it with twine, and slid it across the counter. $7. He handed her a 20. She reached for the till to get change, but he shook his head. Her brow arched slightly. You don't need to overpay. It's worth 7, not 20. Consider it a tip, he said. I don't take tips, she replied evenly, placing the change firmly into his hand. You pay for the fish, nothing else. That stopped him cold. In Manhattan, people tripped over themselves to accept his money. Here, a girl selling fish on a weathered dock had just refused it without hesitation. What's your name? He asked, intrigued. Lila, she said simply. Lila Hart. It was a name that somehow fit her, straightforward, unadorned, with a quiet strength behind it. Ethan walked away with the mackerel in hand, still puzzling over the exchange. He didn't even cook at home. The fish would probably end up in the trash, but that wasn't the point. Over the next few days, he found himself passing her stall more often than was strictly necessary. Sometimes he bought fish. Sometimes he just watched her work, noticing the way her expression softened when an elderly fisherman greeted her, or how her smile appeared, brief but genuine, when her younger brother came by with lunch. One afternoon, he finally asked, Do you even know who I am? Yes, she replied without hesitation. Eyes still on the fish she was cleaning. You're the guy who keeps overpaying for fish he doesn't cook. I don't know why, and I don't care. Ethan almost smiled. Almost. Ethan had always believed people revealed themselves under pressure. In his world, stress peeled away the polished exterior, exposing ambition, greed, or fear. But with Lila, there seemed to be no mask to remove, only a stubborn, unshakable core. He noticed the little things first. How she arrived at the dock before the sun had fully risen, hauling heavy crates of fish from the boats with sleeves rolled up, her breath misting in the cold morning air. How she haggled with customers without ever raising her voice, winning most deals simply because she wouldn't bend unless it was fair. How she laughed, not politely, not because someone said something they expected her to find funny, but freely, and only when she meant it. It was so different from the women Ethan had known in Manhattan. They smiled like it was a weapon, laughed like it was a business deal, and worked rooms as if the right conversation could buy them everything. Lila didn't work rooms. She worked, full stop. One gray morning, clouds low over the harbor, Ethan approached her stall again. She was arranging flounder on the ice, the pale fish gleaming like coins in the dim light. You're out early, he remarked. She gave him a sidelong glance. So are you. He smirked faintly. Difference is, I don't have to be. That's the problem, she replied, not unkindly, but with a hint of challenge in her tone. When you don't have to work for something, you forget what it's worth. He found himself strangely stung by the comment. No one spoke to him like that. Not board members, not employees, not so-called friends. But she had said it without malice, just an observation, like stating the tide was high or the sky was overcast. That day, when a drizzle began to fall, Ethan lingered under the awning of her stall. I can give you a ride home, he offered as she packed up. No thanks, she said, slipping the day's earnings into a worn leather pouch. It's pouring, he insisted, nodding toward the mist that was thickening into rain. I've walked in worse, she replied, pulling her hood over her head. Besides, it's not that far. He watched her walk away through the drizzle, her boots splashing through puddles. She didn't look back once. That night, Ethan sat in his rented cottage, a glass of scotch untouched on the table beside him. He thought of her boots, worn but sturdy, the steady rhythm of her steps, the way she didn't seem to care whether the richest man on the dock offered her comfort or not. It wasn't that she disliked him. It was that she didn't need him. And that, he realized, was why she was getting under his skin. The ice that had sealed his heart for years didn't melt all at once. It cracked, just a hairline fracture at first, almost imperceptible. But each time he saw Lila Hart, working against the wind and salt and cold, the crack widened. And deep down, though he wouldn't admit it to himself yet, Ethan knew, if he stayed in Seabreeze Cove much longer, the walls he had built might not hold. The wind had been restless all morning, rattling the loose metal sheets on the dockside sheds. By afternoon, the clouds rolled in fast from the horizon, heavy, dark, and edged with an eerie green that promised trouble. Ethan was standing with the dock foreman, reviewing blueprints for the renovation, when he caught sight of Lila. She was at her stall, sleeves already soaked, hair plastered to her face as she fought to tie down the canvas awning above the fish display. The first flash of lightning split the sky, followed by a deep, bone-shaking rumble. Most of the vendors had already abandoned their stalls, but Lila stayed, her hands working furiously at the rope. Ethan didn't think. He was moving before the foreman could finish his sentence. "You'll get sick," she shouted when he reached her, the wind tearing at her voice. "You'll lose everything if this blows away," he shot back, grabbing the other end of the rope. Rain hit them in sheets, stinging like tiny stones against their skin. The dock beneath their feet was slick, the boards groaning as waves slapped hard against the pilings. Together, they fought to secure the awning. Her hands moved fast, her fingers red from the cold. He matched her knots with his own, their shoulders bumping as the wind howled through the harbor. When the final rope was tied, Ethan grabbed her elbow. "Enough. We need to get off the dock." "I have to cover the fish," she argued, already reaching for a tarp. "Lila, you can buy more fish. You can't buy another life." She hesitated only a second before the next gust nearly knocked her sideways. Ethan caught her, steadying her against his chest before pulling her into the downpour. They half ran, half fought their way to his rented cottage at the edge of the harbor. By the time they reached the porch, they were drenched to the bone, their breaths coming in ragged bursts. Inside, warmth enveloped them, the faint crackle of the fireplace, the smell of cedar and sea air. Ethan grabbed 2 towels, tossing one to Lila while he shrugged off his soaked jacket. Her hair, darkened by rain, clung to her jawline, drops sliding down her cheeks. "You didn't have to help me," she said, her voice quieter now. "You didn't have to stay out there in the first place," he countered. For a moment, neither spoke. The storm roared outside, the rain hammering the windows, but in the small space between them, there was a different kind of intensity. Lila broke it first. "That stall is all I have. It paid for my brother's school books this year, kept the lights on when the fishing was bad. If I lost it," she shook her head, "I don't get to walk away and still be fine." Ethan studied her, really studied her. The set of her jaw, the calluses on her hands, the weight of responsibility in her eyes. She wasn't just surviving. She was carrying a life far heavier than most could bear, and doing it without complaint. Something shifted in him then, though he couldn't name it yet. "You won't lose it," he said, his voice low but certain. "Not while I'm here." And for the first time since coming to Seabreeze Cove, Ethan meant more than just the harbor renovation. The storm had passed overnight, leaving the harbor washed clean and gleaming under the pale morning sun. The gulls were back, wheeling and crying above the fishing boats. The air felt lighter, until Ethan saw her. Sabrina Clark. She stepped onto the dock like she owned it, heels clicking against the wooden planks, her designer trench coat fluttering in the breeze. Her platinum blonde hair was immaculate despite the sea wind, and her lips curved in that same polished smile Ethan had once mistaken for love. "Ethan," she said smoothly, as if no time had passed. "You're hard to find these days." "That's intentional," he replied, his voice cool. She ignored the edge in his tone. "I heard you were here. Thought I'd drop by. We have unfinished business." Before he could respond, a voice from behind called out, "Morning, Ethan." It was Lila, carrying a crate of fish toward her stall. Her cheeks were flushed from the effort, her hair loose around her shoulders today. She slowed as she noticed Sabrina, her gaze flicking between them. Sabrina's eyes sharpened instantly. She glanced at Lila, then back at Ethan with a small, knowing smirk. "And who is this?" "A new friend." Ethan's jaw tightened. "This is Lila Hart. She runs one of the stalls here." Sabrina's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Ah, a fish seller." She turned to Lila, her voice honeyed but laced with steel. "I suppose you two have been spending time together?" Lila's brow furrowed, but she answered evenly. "We've talked." "Talked," Sabrina echoed, letting the word hang in the air like a challenge. Then she leaned closer to Ethan, her voice dropping low. "Really, Ethan? This is where you've landed? Trading boardrooms for fish markets?" Ethan's temper flared. "I'd rather stand on this dock than in a room full of people pretending to care about me." Sabrina tilted her head, unbothered. "You always did romanticize real people," she said, her gaze flicking toward Lila again. "But trust me, darling, they're just as capable of taking what they can and walking away when it suits them." Lila's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't speak. Instead, she shifted the crate in her arms and turned to go. "Lila," Ethan started, but she was already moving down the dock, her pace quick and deliberate. Sabrina smiled, satisfied. "She's beneath you, Ethan. And deep down, you know it. She'll never fit into your world." He turned on her, voice low and sharp. "Maybe I don't want someone who fits into that world anymore." But Lila, who had paused just out of sight, caught only those last words, "fit into that world," and the bitter twist in his tone. Her stomach tightened. To her ears, it sounded like shame. By the time Ethan caught up with her, she had already reached her stall and busied herself with arranging the morning's catch. "Lila, wait. I have customers," she said without looking at him. Her voice was calm, but the wall between them was back, higher and colder than before. Ethan stood there for a moment, the smell of the sea sharp in his lungs, realizing the storm outside had passed, but the one between them had just begun. For 2 days, Lila kept her distance. She spoke to Ethan only when she had to, her words clipped and polite. He could see the misunderstanding in her eyes, but every attempt to explain was met with the same wall. It gnawed at him. He was used to negotiating billion-dollar deals with hardened executives, yet somehow, convincing one fish seller of his sincerity felt infinitely harder. On the third morning, Ethan woke before dawn with a plan. If words wouldn't reach her, maybe actions would. By the time Lila arrived at the dock, the sun still hidden below the horizon, she found him already standing behind her stall, dressed not in his usual crisp shirt and blazer, but in jeans, boots, and a faded sweatshirt. "What are you doing?" she asked, frowning. "Working," he said simply. "If you'll have me. I don't need help." "Too bad," he replied, rolling up his sleeves. "Because I'm not leaving." And he didn't. For the next several hours, Ethan threw himself into the rhythm of her day. He helped haul crates from the boats, his muscles straining under the unfamiliar weight. He gutted fish under her instruction, clumsy at first, earning an eye roll from her when he nearly mangled a flounder, but improving with each attempt. He even learned how to wrap the fish in paper and tie it neatly with twine, though his knots were slower than hers. When customers came, he called out the prices without hesitation, trying to mimic her steady, no-nonsense tone. Some regulars eyed him curiously, a few even smirking at the sight of the impeccably groomed stranger now smelling strongly of the sea. By midday, Ethan's back ached, his hands were nicked from the knife, and the cuffs of his sweatshirt were soaked. Yet he hadn't felt this alive in years. Lila handed him a bottle of water during a brief lull. "You're terrible at this," she said, though her lips curved faintly at the corners. "But I'm trying," he replied, meeting her eyes. Something in her gaze softened, just a fraction. She looked away, busying herself with rearranging the display, but he caught the small shift. In the afternoon, when a sudden rush of customers arrived after a boat unloaded a fresh catch, Ethan kept pace beside her, passing wrapped parcels, counting change, even shooing away a seagull that tried to snatch a fillet. By the time they closed, the sun was dipping low, painting the harbor in shades of gold and rose. Ethan helped her clean the stall, tossing the last scraps to a pair of grateful cats lurking nearby. As they stacked the empty crates, Lila finally spoke without the edge that had been in her voice for days. "You didn't have to do this." "I did," he said. "Because I meant what I told you before. I don't care about titles, money, or appearances. I care about you, and I'll prove it as many times as it takes." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at him, really looked, and for the first time since Sabrina's arrival, her guarded expression wavered. "Actions," she murmured, "are harder than words." "Then I'll keep acting," he replied without hesitation. The sea breeze stirred between them, carrying the scent of salt and fresh fish. And though Lila didn't smile fully, the wall between them had begun to crack again. The autumn air carried a crisp bite as the ocean waves rolled in, each one glittering under the morning sun. Jack stood at the edge of the pier in his tailored navy coat, watching the fishing boats return from the night's work. His heart beat faster when he saw her, Amelia, hauling crates of fresh fish with that familiar mix of determination and grace. It had been months since the scandal with the investors, the confrontation with Clarissa, and the night Amelia had walked into his life like a stubborn storm. Now, their worlds were not so far apart. Jack had made sure of that. He had sold the luxury condo in the city, purchased a modest seaside home, and, most shockingly to his former colleagues, invested heavily in rebuilding the local fish market. As Amelia stepped onto the pier, she spotted him and froze. "You're early," she called out, brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. "I couldn't sleep," Jack replied, walking toward her. "Besides, I wanted to see you start your day." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "Most people don't find the smell of fish romantic." Jack stopped right in front of her, his eyes steady. "It's not the fish. It's the woman selling them." A flush crept across her cheeks, and for a moment, the bustling market faded into silence. The man who once despised women he thought were too charming to trust, now stood here, completely unguarded. They walked together to her stall. Jack rolled up his sleeves, ignoring the stares of locals who still weren't used to seeing a former corporate shark gutting mackerel. But Amelia noticed something different in those stares now. Respect, maybe even approval. "Jack, you don't have to." "I want to," he interrupted gently. "You've taught me more about honesty and work than all my years in boardrooms ever did. I'm not here to rescue you, Amelia. I'm here to stand beside you." Her eyes shimmered with unspoken emotion. "You're going to ruin that expensive coat," she murmured, slicing into a fish. "I can buy another coat," he said. "But I can't buy another you." The day went on, filled with the rhythm of knives on cutting boards, the calls of fishermen, and the tang of sea salt in the air. When the market finally began to wind down, Jack reached for her hand. "I have something for you," he said, pulling a small, weathered box from his pocket. Inside was a simple silver ring, shaped like a wave. Not a diamond, not a boardroom deal. Just a promise that no matter how high the tide gets, I'll be here. Amelia's throat tightened, tears blurring her vision. "Jack!" She couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Under the orange glow of the setting sun, with the cries of seagulls overhead, she slipped the ring onto her finger. Jack kissed her, tasting the salt of the sea and the warmth of the life they were building, together. For the first time in years, the cold, guarded CEO felt at peace. And somewhere deep inside, he knew this wasn't just the end of a story. It was the start of a lifetime.